All righty. Well, we're back. As I said, today's lecture is all about comedy. And comedy is a very, very personal thing. What may be funny to me might not be funny to you. And that's okay. I sometimes get upset with people when they say, "Oh, you don't know what funny is. That's a hilarious movie. I don't know why you don't like it." Well, it's because something is not funny unless we understand it. That is a very important component to comedy. We must understand what is going on. If we do not understand it, it will not be funny. At the same time, we must be removed from whatever's happening in the story. In other words, it can't be too close. So for something to be funny, we must understand it, but at the same time, we must be removed from it. Now I'll give you an example of that. One of my favorite television shows, comedy shows, when I was growing up was the TV show MASH. I also liked the film MASH. It made me laugh. But when I was in graduate school, my mother died. She was having a heart problems, and they were. She was on an operating table, and she passed away. Well, from that moment to today, it's hard for me to watch the television show MASH. I no longer find it that funny. The scenes of the operations and the blood and all that. It takes me to someplace else. It doesn't take me to a happy place. So I understand it. It's just hard for me to be removed from it. And that's how comedy works. Some things we've experienced, and yet we are somewhat removed from it. I often tell my classes, I say, imagine that there was a mean old man who lived near your home. And this old man would always come by, and he would kick your dog and scream profanities as he walked by your house. And one day you look out your window, and there's been an ice storm, and the sidewalk in front of your home's covered with ice. And as he walks by, he goes to kick your dog, but this time he slides on the ice, his legs fly up into the air, and he comes crashing down on his butt, and we hear a big fart noise. Funny. Could be. Funny. But that might change if it wasn't a mean old man trying to kick your dog, but it was your beloved grandmother who had just gotten out of the hospital for a broken bone. And if she slipped and fell, you might have a different reaction. Then again, you may not. Again, it's up to the individual. So comedy, as I said, it's very, very personal. I began talking before we were interrupted by Harley Quinn. I was talking about character types. And those character types have been with us since the time of the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greeks are known for their love of tragedy, and they're great tragic playwrights, but they also loved comedy. And their comedy is wonderful because they did not worry about offending anyone. Sometimes in their comedies, they would make jokes about people who they knew would be sitting in the audience. And since, especially in Athens, they had total freedom. They could say anything they wanted to, and they did. When the Greeks would do a tragic festival, they would do a number of plays throughout the day. They would always end the festival with a short comedy. And these comedies were called satyr plays. Now, if you don't know what a satyr is half man, half goat. And probably the best example that I'm sure you would recognize would be from Disney's film Hercules, and it's the character of Phil. He was a satyr. And if you remember in that movie, at one point when Hercules first meets him, Phil's chasing some young women, and then the women disappear. They change their form. And they represent nymphs, and that was usually the plot. The story in these satyr plays would be a young satyr running around chasing nymphs. And they were very physical. The comedy was very, very, what today we would call slapstick, lots of falling down, and there were also a lot of sexual jokes that were in these satyr plays. A lot of the Greek comedies were very sexual, and there's a reason for that. If you lived in ancient Greece in these small city-states, part of their religion was procreation. To stay alive, the city-states needed to procreate. They needed to have children. And so they had no hang-ups with sexual jokes of any kind or sexual acts of any kind. And so they worked a lot of those into their comedies. In fact, one of the greatest of the Greek comic writers, who a number of his plays have survived to today, was a gentleman by the name of Aristophanes. Aristophanes lived from 446 BC to 386 BC. Very funny man. He was very political, and a lot of his plays were warnings to the government and to the people of Athens. You see, during his lifetime, when he was writing a lot of his plays, Athens was at war with Sparta. This was a 27-year-long war. And Aristophanes was worried that the cost of this war, not just in money, but in manpower, would destroy Athens. And he brought this up in a number of his plays. And the thing is, he was right. During his lifetime, we would see Athens fall. Sparta would win the war. And in fact, a couple of his last plays were after the fall of Athens. One of his greatest plays, and this will give you a great example of what they were like, was a play called Lysistrata. Lysistrata. Lysistrata was set in Athens, and in the play, what happens is the women of Athens decide that they want to end the war. And they are led by a lady named Lysistrata. And Lysistrata brings together all the women of Athens, along with some representatives from their enemy, Sparta, and Sparta's allies. And what they do is they come up with a plan. And the way to end the war, and she convinces the ladies, and it takes some convincing, that to end the war, they must quit having sex with their husbands. And this would end the war. And of course, the women are worried that they will not be able to do this. And then they come up with a plan is that they are going to lock themselves up in a barricade. All the women would stay together. And with Athena's help, they would overcome the men. They do this. There are some very funny slapstick scenes where the women defeat the local police, the local police commissioner. They take over and barricade themselves in, and then the play jumps time several weeks later, and we see the result. The men are very worked up, let's say, and they really need their wives. And one of the generals of the army shows up, and he wants to see his wife, Marini. And it's one of the funniest scenes I think I've ever read or seen. And Canisius, the general, tries to get Marini to come out of the barricade. Lysistrata tells Marini, go out and tease him, but do not give in unless he agrees to peace. And so she does. She comes out. He begs her to have sex with him. She teases him, says, yes, she will, but first he has to get a mattress. And then he runs off and gets a mattress. And then she needs blankets, and then pillows, and then she needs perfume. I mean, it's all these things he has to go and get. And finally, she lays down, and she goes, now you are going to sue for peace. And his answer is, I'll think about it. And he jumps up in the air and gets ready to land on her, and she rolls out of the way, and he crashes to the ground, hurting himself, and she runs back into the barricade. Finally, at the end of the play, the women are victorious. The men, the Spartan men and the Athenian men agree to peace. And as often happened at the end of the plays of Aristophanes, they have a big party. And even the audience is invited to come up and join them. So Aristophanes, in his plays, creates some character types that will live on and are still with us today. Time goes by, and we go to Italy in the 16th century. And this is what I was talking about before we were interrupted. There is a group of street players, traveling theater companies. Today we call them the Commedia dell'arte, or the Italian comedy. And in the Commedia dell'arte, each actor portrayed a character type. And these types became very, very famous. And that no matter what the story was, and again, they were improvisational groups. They didn't write down their scripts. It wasn't until much later when the playwright Molière would begin to write some plays using these same characters. But they would improvise the story, and they always had the same stock characters. The main character, I hope she doesn't come jumping back in here. The main character was a servant character named Harlequin. Harlequin carried, which I was beaten with earlier, a slapstick. This is a slapstick. It is made with a hinge, so the back opens up and you slap it. That way you can pretend to hit someone without hurting them. Harlequin always carried the slapstick, and he would use it for many things. It could become an instrument He could use it to be a weapon. It could be a sword, or just a stick to hit someone with. He also had a costume that was covered in patches. And these patches would be pieces of the costumes of all the other characters in the play. And that made him the center point. He drove the action of the play. He was the protagonist in all the stories. And then the other characters would revolve around him. Harlequin, in one way, was not very bright. He usually didn't have much of an education, but he was very street smart. And in the end of every story, Harlequin would always win the day. It didn't matter who he was with. Well, there was one character, which I'll bring up in a moment, who might beat him. But all the other characters would always lose to Harlequin. He would win out. Whatever he wanted to do would take place. He was abused by his masters, so the audience enjoyed watching him as he worked to get even with whoever was bothering him at the time. One of the character who could defeat Harlequin, if need be, was a female character, and her name was Columbina. Columbina wore a costume very similar to Harlequin's. It was also covered with the patches from all the other characters. She was the female version of Harlequin. If she was in the story with Harlequin, she would be his love interest. In a story, things would happen, and Harlequin may think he was smarter than her, but because she would pretend that she didn't know as much as he did. And in the end, the audience would know she was actually much brighter than he, and she would pretend not to be, to let him have his day. So sometimes she was the one who would fix everything for the characters. Harlequin and Columbina, like I said, are still with us. We see them in a lot of stories. I'll give you a good example. If you've ever watched Bugs Bunny, Bugs Bunny is the Harlequin character in all the cartoons. And Bugs sometimes has a girlfriend, and when he does, that is Columbina. Another character that was very important was the father character. He would be a father. Quite often he was a miser. He would be pretty evil to Harlequin, would treat Harlequin badly, but then would turn around and need Harlequin's help to solve his problems. He went by many names. The name that I would like you to know is Pantaloon. Pantaloon, again, like all these characters, wore a half mask. Quite often in the stories, he was a miser. He loved money more than his children. He loved money more than anything, and he was always paranoid that somebody was going to take his money. You see this character, he's around today. There was a very popular television show in the 60s called Gilligan's Island. Of course, Gilligan was the Harlequin character. But Thurston Howell III, that character and his wife, Mrs. Howell, they loved money more than anything. And they would, from show to show, would need Gilligan to do things for them, and quite often it had to do with them getting more money. We'll come back to that in a moment, but this character is very much with us now, Pantaloon. Another character was the captain. The captain was a military figure. He carried a sword. He usually dressed in pretty elaborate clothing. If not a military uniform, it would suggest a military uniform. He thought he was very handsome, and he would talk often about how brave he was, when in fact the character was a coward. This character is also still with us, but he would do funny things. He would never admit that he was afraid. I mean, you would hear this character say things like, somebody would come up to them after, say, a battle and say, "Captain, I saw you running away. Were you afraid?" And the captain would respond, "Oh, no, I was not running away. I was leading the charge in the opposite direction." I mean, he always found a way to get out of people knowing that he was the coward. The famous comedy duo Bud Abbott and Lou Costello. Bud Abbott was this character, and they would come up somewhere, maybe a scary house, and Bud Abbott would turn to Costello and say, "Lou, you go in there first, and I'll stay out here where it's really dangerous." And of course, Lou would get fooled and would go do this. The captain sometimes was a friend to Pantaloon. Sometimes he would be a rival. It just depended on where they took the story. But he always was a coward, yet pretended that he was brave. Another favorite character that you would see in a lot of these shows was the doctor, or doctore. The doctor would either be a medical doctor or a PhD. He might work at a university and be a professor. The doctor would pretend to be very intelligent, extremely intelligent, but in the long run, not so. Especially, he usually had no common sense. In the time of the Commedia, a lot of times they would, the doctor would speak in gibberish Latin. In other words, he wouldn't use the real words. He might look at someone who was injured and go, "Oh, the penitellum of the Abruzzo is fortified, and therefore we must suggest the use of an enema." They liked enemas a lot. They did a lot of those in their comedies. But he actually had no idea what he was saying or anything else. He just liked to use big words. If we go back to Gilligan's Island, they actually had a captain, and he was called the skipper, and they actually had a doctor, but they called him the professor. And I used to laugh as a kid watching that show, because the professor would always come up with ideas for them to get off the island, and they never worked. None of his ideas would work. But, he was a smart guy, and he would continue working on them. A fun character was another servant character. His name was Brigalia. Brigalia was usually a big guy. He was very, very dumb. He loved to eat, and that quite often was his bit. He would eat tons of food, lots of food. He was always hungry. And if they needed it, he played an instrument. He would play the guitar or the lute or whatever was needed, and whatever the actor who was playing him could play. But he would play an instrument. He was usually the sidekick to Harlequin. And though he was the sidekick, he often thought of himself as smarter than Harlequin, even though he was not very bright at all. This character is still with us. We see him in a lot of comedies, a lot of cartoons. He can be a bully, but he's not very bright. Regalia. These comedies, in the Commedia dell'arte, there was always a group of lovers. The lovers served one purpose. They were to be in love. They sang, and they would sing very well, and they would be very pretty, and their costumes were very pretty. They often played the young lovers. They would be the children, say, to Pantaloon. And as children, even though they were usually very wealthy, they had no common sense. They would cry because they were in trouble, and they would beg Colombina or Harlequin to save them. And of course, then they would. Save them from their mean old daddy, who were Pantaloon. The most famous of these characters, and they went by a lot of different names, but the most famous character was a character called Isabella. And I think this is an interesting story. Isabella came about from an actress named Isabella Andrini. Isabella Andrini was an actress. She was in the Commedia dell'arte, and she always played the young lover. She was so beloved by audiences and by the other actors, and she became so famous that when she died, when the actress died, they, from then on, named one of the female lovers Isabella. And it's still around today, and you'll see that character in a lot of shows. But it all comes from one actress, Isabella Andrini. Okay. Now, I've been saying that these characters are around today. And one of the best examples I can give you is from a cartoon, a very popular cartoon. My kids love it, and a lot of adults love it because the comedy in the show is on many different levels, and that is SpongeBob SquarePants. The characters in SpongeBob are nothing more than redrawn Commedia dell'arte characters. The leading character, SpongeBob, a servant, works at the Krusty Krab, who, though not very bright, in the end always wins. SpongeBob works for a man who is a miser. He's actually a crab, Mr. Krabs. Mr. Krabs is a miser. He'll do anything. Money, money, money. I want money, money, money. That's all he thinks about. He will sell his daughter for money. He will do anything. And I always thought that was funny. His daughter is a whale, Pearl, who actually is the lover character in the show. She is the young lover. Other characters. We have a scientist who invents things, and quite often they don't work very well. That's Sandy Squirrel. We have a captain. We have a character who thinks they're better than everyone else. Doesn't matter what it is, they always believe that they are right. They're smarter than everyone, more cultured than everyone. Though he doesn't carry a sword, or he's not in the military, but that's Squidward. We have another villain father character, Plankton, who could also be a form of the captain. And we have a very dumb sidekick who thinks about eating most of the time, who believes he's smarter than SpongeBob, but really is not. And what's funny in the show is SpongeBob actually thinks this character is smarter than he is, and often takes his advice, and that's how they get into trouble. But that's Patrick Star. So those Commedia characters are alive and well. Now, in the Commedia dell'arte, they also had a lot of minor characters. And they referred to these minor characters as zanies. And of course, in SpongeBob, there are a lot of these zanies. And depending on what story they're doing, different ones will appear, whether it's Larry the Lobster or whoever. But the Commedia use the zanies. They're the minor characters, and they, again, play different roles depending on what is needed. Another animation, I just thought about this last night, another animation that I like, and I didn't realize until I started to think about it, that they were Commedia characters, is Futurama. If you look at each one of those characters, they are all taken from the Commedia dell'arte. Get with your friends, have a cup of coffee or something else, and discuss Futurama. I think you'll find that the Commedia characters are alive and well.